and the fact that in July 2014 an armed conflict was taking place in Ukraine received consideration drafting the indictment. As you know, in July 2014, eastern Ukraine was the scene of heavy fighting between the Ukrainian armed forces and various armed groups. It is true that the rules that apply in wartime and peacetime may differ. This is the doctrine of combatant immunity, according to which military personnel may participate in hostilities within the limits of international law. These different rules, however, apply only to regular military personnel operating under the authority of a state in a group that respects international humanitarian law and rules of warfare. Other people who commit acts of violence in an armed conflict are subject to the ordinary rules laid down in criminal law. War is not a license for violence by all against everybody. That's not the case in the Netherlands, nor is it the case in Australia, Belgium, Malaysia, Ukraine, or the Russian Federation. All states in the world in recent centuries have devised rules of warfare to limit the consequence of war violence as much as possible. The guiding principle is that wars are fought between military combatants and that civilians are not involved in any way. If civilians in Ukraine use violence against Dutch, Malaysian, Australian, and Belgian citizens, this violence, therefore, lies within the scope of the ordinary criminal laws of these countries. These civilians commit ordinary crimes such as murder and the downing of an aircraft, leading to the deaths of its occupants. Regardless of whether they used a rifle or an advanced rocket launcher, and regardless of whether the intended victims were civilians or combatants. The same holds true for armed fighters in Ukraine who claim to be ordinary civilians. Ordinary criminal law applies to them as well. A license or immunity for deadly violence is granted only in very exceptional situations. This does not happen in situations of chaos and lawlessness, but exclusively when using controlled and proportionate force. Controlled means regular soldiers who are recognizable as such, who fight under the responsibility of a state in an organizational form which respects international humanitarian law. So not groups fighting independently or who fail to respect laws of armed conflict. Like any other civilians, members of such armed groups are not allowed to use force. Like anybody else, they are subject to ordinary criminal law. The same applies to soldiers who pretend to be ordinary civilians. This is also not allowed because it instigates reciprocal violence against real civilians. For this reason, soldiers concealing their true identity may be punished for resorting to such violence. To date, the defendants in this case have never asserted that in July 2014 they were regular military personnel operating on behalf of a state in Ukraine.